I woke up in a psychiatric clinic with no idea how I'd gotten there, with my mother signing papers declaring me incapable and transferring my entire $2 million inheritance into her hands. The worst part? She was doing it with a smile and saying it was out of love. The smell of hospital disinfectant invaded my nostrils like a sharp blade as I tried to focus my blurred vision on the strange, cold environment surrounding me. My head throbbed with unbearable pain that seemed to come from inside my skull, as if someone was hammering my brain with brutal and constant force. The white walls of the private psychiatric clinic seemed to move and undulate before my confused eyes, creating a nauseating sense of disorientation that made me question whether I was actually awake or still trapped in some terrible nightmare. My 32 years of life seemed to have dissolved into a dense and impenetrable fog, leaving only confused fragments of memories that I couldn't organize into any logical sequence. Where am I? How did I get here? Why can't I remember anything that happened in the last few hours? Were questions hammering my mind like deafening drums, creating a painful echo that reverberated throughout my entire being. My body was dressed in a light blue hospital gown that smelled of chemicals and made me feel vulnerable and exposed, as if they had stripped away not just my clothes, but also my dignity and identity. I tried to sit up on the narrow bed with rough sheets, but a violent dizziness knocked me back against the hard pillow, while my stomach churned with nausea that seemed to come from another world. It was as if my own body was a stranger I no longer recognized, reacting in completely unpredictable ways to every attempt at movement I made. The sound of high heels echoing through the cold and silent corridor of the clinic made my heart race uncontrollably, creating a frantic rhythm that seemed to want to escape from my chest. I would recognize that characteristic sound anywhere in the world. They were the expensive Italian shoes that my mother Margaret wore on all important occasions, those red leather ones she had bought on a trip to Europe, and that always made this distinctive noise when they touched hard surfaces. But why would she be here? Why would my mother be in a psychiatric clinic where I had woken up with no memory of how I'd arrived? The door to the room opened slowly with a metallic creak that gave me chills, and there she was, Margaret, my 58-year-old mother, wearing her impeccable gray suit and carrying a leather folder that seemed to contain important documents. Her gray hair was perfectly arranged as always, her blue eyes shone with a strange intensity I had never seen before, and on her lips was a smile that mixed satisfaction with something I couldn't completely identify. "Beatrice, my dear daughter, you're finally awake. I was so worried about you," she said in a sweet voice that sounded completely fake to my confused ears. There was something deeply wrong with the whole situation, something my instinct screamed as dangerous, but my mind, dulled by medications, couldn't process properly. "Mom? What's happening? Why am I here?" "I don't remember anything," I managed to whisper in a hoarse voice I barely recognized as my own. Margaret approached my bed with calculated and delicate steps, placing the folder on the bedside table next to a plastic cup of water that tasted like medicine. She held my hand in an apparently affectionate way, but her fingers were as cold as ice, and her grip had a firmness that deeply bothered me, as if it were more possessive than maternal. "Darling, you had a very serious psychotic episode last night. You tried to hurt yourself and were completely out of touch with reality, saying things that made no sense at all," she explained with a tone of voice that tried to sound concerned, but to my ears seemed too rehearsed, too artificial, like an actress playing a part she had memorized. Each word that came out of her mouth created more confusion in my already disturbed mind, because I couldn't remember absolutely anything she was describing. The last clear thing in my memory was having dinner with her the night before in her luxurious apartment, talking about my plans to travel to Europe with the inheritance I had received from my grandfather. "I don't remember any of this, Mom. This doesn't make sense. I was fine yesterday, we had dinner together and talked normally about the trip." I tried to argue, but my voice came out weak and uncertain, betraying the total confusion that dominated my thoughts. Margaret squeezed my hand harder, her blue eyes fixing on mine with a disturbing intensity. "Beatrice, you need to trust me. I am your mother and I only want what's best for you. The doctor said you might have episodes where you don't remember important things. It's part of your condition." Margaret's words created a storm of doubts and fears in my mind already weakened by the medications that ran through my system like a dense and suffocating fog. How is it possible that I had a psychotic episode and couldn't remember absolutely anything? Why did my memory have a black void exactly between dinner with her and waking up in this clinic? I tried to concentrate on recovering some memory of what had happened, forcing my mind to work through the chemical fog that seemed to envelop every thought, but I found only darkness and confused fragments that didn't connect in any logical way. "Mom, I need to talk to someone." "I want to call Julia, she's my best friend, and she'll be worried if she doesn't know where I am," I said, trying to sit up again despite the dizziness that made the world spin. Margaret immediately gently pushed me back to bed, her smile becoming firmer and more controlling. "Don't worry about that now, darling. I've already talked to everyone who needed to know about your situation. The important thing is for you to focus on getting well." There was something in the way she said this that made me feel a chill run down my spine, as if I was being purposely isolated from the outside world. The feeling of being trapped in an invisible web began to grow in my chest, mixed with the frustration of not being able to think clearly due to the medications that continued to affect my system. "Why do I feel that there's something you're not telling me, Mom? Why do I have the feeling that something very important is being hidden from me?" I asked directly, observing her reaction with all the attention I could gather. Margaret's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, so quickly that anyone in a normal state might have missed this micro-expression, but my survival instinct was sharpened and caught every nuance of her carefully made-up face. "Beatrice, you're being paranoid. That's also part of your condition. The doctors warned me that you might distrust even the people who love you the most," she replied, quickly regaining her composure and returning to caress my hand in an apparently affectionate way. But now I was paying attention to every detail, every word, every gesture, trying to decipher what was really happening to me. The leather folder she had brought remained there on the bedside table, and I could see that there were documents inside it. Official papers with letterheads that appeared to be from a notary office or court. "What documents are those, Mom? Why did you bring official papers to a medical visit?" I asked, pointing to the folder with a trembling finger. Margaret looked quickly at the folder and then back at me, and this time she couldn't completely hide the nervousness that shone in her blue eyes for a fleeting moment. "They're just medical documents, darling. Papers that the doctors needed me to sign to authorize your treatment here at the clinic," she explained. But her voice had a slightly higher pitch than normal, a subtle change that my trained daughter's ear could detect. It was the same vocal alteration she had when she lied to my father during the troubled years of marriage, before the divorce that had left our family shattered. "Can I see those documents? I have the right to know what's being done to me, don't I?" I insisted, trying to extend my hand toward the folder, but she quickly moved it out of my reach. "Beatrice, you need to rest and not worry about medical bureaucracies that will only further confuse your already disturbed mind," said Margaret with growing firmness in her voice, tucking the folder under her arm as if protecting a valuable treasure. At that moment, a nurse entered the room carrying a tray with medications and a glass of fresh water, interrupting our tense conversation just as I was beginning to ask more specific questions about the mysterious documents. The nurse was a young woman of about 25, with black hair tied in a bun and a professional smile that didn't reach her tired eyes. "Time for medication, Mrs. Beatrice. You need to take these pills to maintain your emotional stability," she said, offering me 3 pills of different colors that I didn't recognize. I looked at the medications with growing distrust, feeling that there was something deeply wrong with this entire orchestrated situation. "What medications are these? I've never taken psychiatric drugs in my life. I want to speak with the doctor in charge before taking anything," I said, pushing the tray away. Margarete immediately intervened with authority. "Daughter, you need to cooperate with the treatment. The doctors know what's best for you." The nurse looked at Margaret as if waiting for confirmation, and my mother nodded affirmatively, as if she had the authority to decide about my medical treatment. This exchange of glances between them was like an alarm signal ringing in my confused mind. Why was a nurse seeking approval from my mother instead of speaking directly to me about my own medications? The realization that something was terribly wrong began to form in my mind like a storm approaching on the distant horizon, bringing with it icy winds of suspicion and fear. I categorically refused to take the medications, crossing my arms over my chest and staring at both Margaret and the nurse with a determination that surprised even myself. "I won't take anything until someone explains to me exactly what is happening to me, where I am, and why I'm here against my will," I declared with a firmness that made my voice sound stronger than I expected. The nurse looked nervously at Margaret, clearly uncomfortable with my resistance, while my mother sighed dramatically as if I were a stubborn child causing unnecessary problems. "Beatrice, you're in a private psychiatric clinic because you had a serious mental breakdown. I brought you here to receive the best treatment possible," she said, trying to sound patient, but I could detect growing irritation in her controlled voice. "And who decided I needed psychiatric hospitalization? Who signed the admission papers? I don't remember agreeing to this," I questioned, my mind beginning to work more clearly as the adrenaline of suspicion burned through the fog of previous medications. Margareta exchanged another meaningful look with the nurse, and it was at that moment that I began to understand that there was a conspiracy happening around me, a carefully orchestrated plan of which I was simultaneously the target and the unconscious victim. The feeling of being manipulated grew in my stomach like a writhing snake, bringing nausea that had nothing to do with medications. During the following minutes, I observed with growing attention each movement, each word, each micro-expression of Margaret and the nurse, trying to decipher the secrets that were clearly being hidden from me. The nurse continued insisting that I take the medications, explaining that they were essential for my stability. But when I asked the specific names of the drugs and what they were for, she began to stutter and look to Margaret for guidance. "They're mood stabilizers and mild anxiolytics, nothing that will harm you," my mother said, answering instead of the nurse, but the way she avoided specific details made me suspect even more. I asked to see the medication information leaflet, a basic right of any patient. But both the nurse and Margaret began using psychological pressure tactics to convince me to simply obey without questioning. "Beatrice, your resistance to taking the medications is further proof that you're not thinking clearly. Mentally healthy people trust doctors and follow the prescribed treatment," my mother said in a tone that mixed false concern with clear manipulation. It was exactly the kind of emotional blackmail she always used on me during my childhood and adolescence, making me feel guilty for questioning her decisions or having opinions different from hers. But this time it was different. Much more than family tantrums or lifestyle disagreements was at stake. My freedom, my autonomy, and possibly even my financial future were at stake, considering I had inherited a significant amount from my paternal grandfather a few months earlier. The suspicion that began as a vague feeling was transforming into a cold and terrible certainty that I was being victimized by some kind of elaborate scheme. The nurse finally left the room after 15 minutes of frustrated insistence, taking with her the medications I had refused and muttering something about calling the doctor in charge to talk to me. Margarete remained by my side, but her mask of concerned mother was beginning to slip, revealing underneath a harder, more calculating expression that made me question whether I really knew my own mother. During the 20 minutes we were alone in the cold clinic room, I tried to extract information from her through seemingly innocent questions about how long I would be hospitalized, how much the treatment cost, and who was paying the medical expenses. Her answers were evasive and contradictory, changing versions as I asked new questions, as if she were inventing explanations on the spot rather than simply reporting true facts. "The important thing is for you to focus on getting better, not worry about money or bureaucracies," she repeated whenever I asked about practical aspects of the hospitalization. But I insisted because I had a growing feeling that my 2 million Ries inheritance was somehow connected to this bizarre situation. When I specifically mentioned the money I had inherited from my grandfather, I observed Margaret stiffen almost imperceptibly, her blue eyes shining with something that seemed to be poorly disguised greed. "You don't need to worry about these things now, Beatrice. When you're better, we'll talk about the future," she said. But there was a coldness in her voice that I had never heard before, a coldness that made me understand I was facing a stranger wearing my mother's face. "Dr. Santos arrived in the room at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, carrying an even more voluminous folder than Margaret's, and displaying a professional smile that couldn't completely hide the discomfort in his brown eyes. He was a dark-skinned man of 45, wearing an expensive suit and a golden tie that suggested considerable financial success. But there was something in his body posture that immediately made me distrust his intentions. He greeted Margaret with a familiarity that went beyond a normal doctor-family relationship, and I could perceive in the exchange of glances between them a complicity that completely gave me chills. "How is our patient today?" "I hope she's feeling calmer and more receptive to treatment," he said, addressing me with a condescending tone that deeply irritated me. He wasn't a doctor, I immediately realized. His way of speaking, his gestures, his approach were those of a lawyer, not a mental health professional. "Excuse me, doctor, but what is your medical specialty? Are you a psychiatrist, psychologist, general practitioner?" I asked directly, observing how he hesitated before answering. "I am a specialist in complex cases like yours, which involve medical and legal issues simultaneously," he responded vaguely, confirming my suspicions that he wasn't a doctor at all. Margaret quickly intervened. "Doctor, Santos is here to explain some necessary procedures to ensure you receive the best possible treatment." The fact that she said Dr. Santos instead of doctor also confirmed that he was probably a lawyer, not a doctor, using a title that technically belonged to him but was being used to deceive me about his true function in that orchestrated situation. "Dr. Santos opened his folder with calculated movements and removed a stack of official documents that made my stomach churn just looking at them. They were letter-headed papers from notary offices, courts, and government agencies that clearly had nothing to do with medical treatment or voluntary psychiatric hospitalization. "Beatrice, due to the severity of your current mental condition, it was necessary to take some legal measures to protect your interests and ensure that you receive adequate care," he explained with a professional calmness that contrasted brutally with the growing panic I felt in my chest. I took the documents with trembling hands and began to read, my eyes widening as I understood the magnitude of what was being done to me without my knowledge or consent. They were judicial interdiction papers, documents that declared me legally incapable of managing my own life and my own assets, transferring all authority over my existence to Margaret as my responsible guardian. My inheritance of 2 million reais, the house I had bought with part of the money, my bank account, my investments, everything was being transferred to my mother's complete control through a legal process that had been conducted without my knowledge of its existence. This can't be legal. You can't interdict me without giving me a chance to defend myself. I'm not incapable of anything, I shouted, feeling anger and despair explode simultaneously in my chest like an emotional bomb.
Doctor.
Santos maintained his calm and professional expression. Everything was done within the strictest legality, with medical evaluations that proved your temporary incapacity to make rational decisions about your life and assets. The word temporary echoed in my mind like a blatant lie that confirmed my worst fears about that terrible situation. If it was really temporary, why were they permanently transferring all my assets to Margaret? Why did the documents mention permanent guardianship and comprehensive asset management? I continued reading the papers with growing horror, discovering that I had supposedly undergone a psychiatric evaluation that considered me psychotic, delusional, and incapable of rational judgment on financial and personal matters. When was this evaluation done? I don't remember undergoing any psychiatric examination, I protested, but Dr. Santos simply pointed to a date on the document, exactly 2 days before, at a time when my only memory was of having a quiet dinner with Margarete. The coincidence was too obvious to be real. They had drugged me during dinner, taken me unconscious for a forged evaluation, and used that false assessment to obtain my judicial interdiction in record time. Dr. Oliveira, our responsible psychiatrist, can better explain the technical details of your condition, said Dr. Santos, as if he were offering a favor instead of revealing another layer of the conspiracy against me. Margaret remained silent beside the bed, but I could see in her blue eyes a poorly disguised satisfaction that made me understand that she had meticulously planned all of this, probably for months or even years. The woman who gave birth to me, who supposedly loved me more than anything in life, had orchestrated my legal and financial destruction with a coldness that made me question whether I really knew my own mother, or if she had always been a stranger wearing a maternal mask.
Doctor.
Oliveira entered the room like an actress stepping onto a stage, carrying a medical record that seemed to have been prepared specifically for this theatrical moment. She was a blonde woman in her 50s, wearing an impeccable white coat and golden glasses that gave her an appearance of medical authority. But there was something in her overly studied movements that made me immediately realize she was playing a role instead of practicing genuine medicine. Her smile was cold and calculated. Her light eyes showed none of the empathy one would expect from a mental health professional dealing with a patient in crisis. Beatriz, I am Dr. Oliveira, responsible for your psychiatric evaluation that determined the need for hospitalization and protective legal measures, she said in a soft voice that sounded completely artificial to my ears. She opened the medical record with theatrical gestures and began to read a description of my supposed mental condition that seemed to have been taken from a psychiatry manual rather than based on real observation. The patient presents with acute psychosis with persecutory delusions, auditory hallucinations, and complete loss of critical judgment about her financial and personal reality, she read aloud, as if citing a clinical case from a textbook. Each word was a carefully constructed lie to justify the legal theft of my assets and my freedom. This is completely false. I've never had hallucinations or delusions. You're inventing a diagnosis to rob me, I shouted, but Dr. Oliveira simply noted something in the record and looked at Margaret with an expression suggesting that my reaction was exactly what they expected. See how she reacts aggressively when confronted with the reality of her condition, Dr. Oliveira said to Margaret, as if I weren't present in the room, or as if my opinion about my own mental sanity was irrelevant. It was a cruel psychological tactic that transformed any protest of mine into additional proof of my supposed insanity. If I remained calm, it was because I was sedated or in denial. If I protested, it was because I was agitated and delusional. There was no way to win in that manipulative game, where my own defense was used as evidence against me.
Doctor.
Santos observed the interaction with professional interest, occasionally making notes on his own papers as if documenting evidence for future use in court. The realization that I was being subjected to an elaborate and well-orchestrated farce filled me with a cold and determined anger that burned through the fog of medications that still ran through my system. I demand an independent second medical opinion, I demand to speak with a lawyer who is not complicit with you. I demand my rights as a Brazilian citizen, I declared with all the strength I could gather. But the three people around me simply exchanged condescending looks as if I were a petulant child making impossible demands. Margarete finally spoke, and her voice had a hardness I had never heard before. Beatrice, you need to accept that you are not in a condition to make decisions about your life right now. I am doing this out of love, to protect you from yourself. The word love coming from her mouth sounded like a blasphemy that made me feel actual physical nausea. This was how she justified the theft of my freedom and my money, as an act of maternal love. The three conspirators remained in my room for another 40 minutes, forcing me to sign documents that I categorically refused to read or accept, but which they said would be considered valid even without my signature due to my declared legal incapacity. It was a Kafkaesque situation where my refusal to cooperate with my own robbery was presented as additional evidence of my need for guardianship. Dr. Santos explained in cold detail that Margarete now had total legal power over all my decisions: where I would live, what medical treatments I would receive, how my money would be spent, with whom I could or could not have contact. It was as if I had legally become a child again, but a child whose parents had clear financial interests in maintaining her incapacity. Your mother has decided that the best for you is to remain committed to this clinic for an undetermined period, until your condition completely stabilizes, said Dr. Oliveira, and the word undetermined made me understand that they intended to keep me locked up there indefinitely, perhaps until I actually went truly insane. Throughout the conversation, I tried to mentally record every word, every contradiction, every piece of evidence of the conspiracy that I could use in the future to prove my sanity and reverse this terrible situation. But I also realized that it would be extremely difficult to convince any external authority that I was the victim of a setup, especially when there were official documents attesting to my mental incapacity signed by apparently credentialed professionals. The feeling of being trapped in a legal web impossible to escape grew in my chest like a serpent feeding on my despair. When the three finally left the room, leaving me alone with my terrified thoughts and impotent rage, I began to mentally plan my strategy for survival and eventual escape from that prison disguised as a medical clinic. The first thing I needed to do was find a way to contact the outside world without Margaret or her accomplices knowing. I remembered that Julia, my best friend since college, was a lawyer specializing in human rights, and would certainly be looking for me if I had disappeared without warning. She knew my personality well enough to know that I would never have a psychotic break in the way described by the conspirators, and would certainly question any official version that tried to explain my sudden absence. The problem was how to contact her without being discovered by the clinic staff who were clearly being paid to keep me incommunicado with anyone who could help in my defense. During the hours that followed, I carefully observed every movement of the nurses and security guards, trying to identify surveillance patterns that I could exploit to send a message to the outside. The clinic operated with military efficiency, but like any human system, it had flaws that a determined and observant person could eventually discover and exploit to their advantage. I need to be smarter than them, I thought with fierce determination. I need to prove that I am completely sane and that all of this is an elaborate farce to rob me. During the night, I pretended to be deeply sedated by the medications I had refused, but which they claimed to have given me through forced injections. In reality, I was completely alert and paying attention to every sound, every whispered conversation in the hallway, every movement of the night staff who patrolled the rooms with decreased frequency after midnight. It was during one of these silent vigils that I discovered something crucial. One of the nurses on the dawn shift was clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation, making low-voiced comments to a colleague about how that young woman doesn't seem crazy like the others, and questioning why I was being kept in such strict isolation. She was a young Brazilian woman of approximately 28 years old, with curly hair and a naturally kind expression that contrasted with the professional coldness of the other staff members. I decided she would be my best chance of getting external help, but I would need to approach her extremely carefully so as not to arouse suspicion or put both of us in danger. During the following days, I observed her schedules and work patterns, identifying the exact moment when she was alone with me for a few minutes during shift changes. When I finally had the opportunity, I looked directly into her brown eyes and whispered with all the sincerity I could convey, "Please help me. I'm not crazy. I'm the victim of a conspiracy to rob me. I need someone to call my friend Julia and tell her what's happening here." I saw in her eyes that she believed me, at least partially, because her expression changed from distant professional to genuinely concerned. The nurse, whom I discovered was named Carla, looked at me for long seconds before whispering back, "I can't get involved in this. If they find out I helped you, I'll lose my job and might even be sued." But there was hesitation in her voice. an internal struggle between professional fear and moral conscience that gave me hope she would eventually make the right decision. During the following days, Carla began to observe me more closely during her shifts, clearly evaluating my behavior to form her own opinion about my mental sanity. I made an effort to demonstrate complete lucidity in all our interactions. I answered her questions rationally and coherently, showed no signs of agitation or excessive paranoia, and discussed complex topics in a way that proved my intact intellectual capacity. Gradually, I could see in her eyes that she was coming to the conclusion that I really was the victim of some kind of injustice. It was on a Thursday night, exactly 1 week after my forced arrival at the clinic, that Carla finally approached my bed during the quietest shift of the early morning and whispered, "Give me your friend's number. I'll call her tomorrow when I leave work." The gratitude I felt at that moment was so intense I almost cried, but I controlled myself to avoid drawing attention from other staff members who might be observing our interaction. Dictating Julia's number to Carla was like launching a bottle with a distress message into the ocean. A small but real hope that someone from the outside world would finally know that I was alive and being held prisoner against my will. "Tell her I'm at Santa Helena Clinic, that my mother has illegally interdicted me, and that I urgently need legal help," I whispered, trying to convey as much useful information as possible in the shortest time. The call that Carla made to Julia triggered a sequence of events that would completely change the course of my terrible situation. Julia, as I had predicted, was absolutely shocked to learn that I had disappeared a week ago, without anyone informing her about my supposed psychiatric hospitalization. She had known my family for years and knew exactly the kind of manipulative person Margaret had always been, especially regarding money and control over my life. As a lawyer specialized in human rights, Julia immediately recognized the signs of a fraudulent interdiction and began investigating the legal documents that had been used to declare me incompetent. What she discovered was even worse than I had imagined. Margaret had hired a complete network of corrupt professionals, including the fake Dr. Santos and Dr. Oliveira, to orchestrate a legal scam that was being replicated in other similar cases, involving wealthy elderly people and young adults with significant inheritances. It was an organized criminal scheme that used the Brazilian judicial system to legalize property theft through fraudulent interdictions. Julia immediately began preparing a lawsuit to reverse my interdiction, but she also did something even smarter. She began investigating the other professionals involved in the scheme, looking for evidence that they had committed the same crimes against other victims. For 3 intense days, she worked almost 24 hours a day, collecting testimonies, analyzing documents, and building a case that would not only free me, but also dismantle the entire criminal network that had victimized me. The turning point came on a gray Monday, when Julia secured an emergency court order determining my immediate release from the clinic and the temporary suspension of the interdiction until an independent psychiatric evaluation could be conducted by professionals not involved in the original case. She arrived at Santa Helena Clinic accompanied by 2 court officers, a state forensic psychiatrist, and a public prosecutor specialized in financial crimes, creating a veritable legal army that Margaret and her accomplices had not foreseen in their carefully orchestrated plans. When I saw Julia entering my room wearing her black lawyer suit and carrying a folder full of official documents, I cried with relief for the first time in a week, feeling as if I were being rescued from a nightmare that had completely consumed my existence. "Beatrice, I've come to get you out of here, and we'll make sure these people pay for everything they've done to you," she said, hugging me tightly while the court officers formally notified the clinic administration about the court order. The forensic psychiatrist accompanying her, Dr. Ribeiro, was a serious 60-year-old man who immediately began asking technical questions about my mental state, my medications, and the circumstances of my admission. His questions were completely different from those Dr. Oliveira had asked. They were genuine, based on real medical knowledge, and clearly intended to assess my sanity objectively, rather than confirm a pre-established diagnosis. In 15 minutes of conversation with him, it was obvious that I was completely lucid and had been the victim of an elaborate medical farce. The final confrontation with Margaret happened in the courtroom itself, in an emergency hearing convened to decide on the validity of my interdiction and the legitimacy of the procedures that had been used against me. Margaret arrived at court accompanied by Dr. Santos and Dr. Oliveira, all formally dressed and displaying the arrogant confidence of people who believed their scheme was perfect and impossible to uncover. But Julia had prepared a devastating presentation that exposed every lie, every forged document, every illegal procedure they had used to rob me. The most impactful moment of the hearing was when the public prosecutor presented evidence that the same group had applied similar scams to at least 12 other victims in the last 2 years. all people with significant inheritances who had been declared incapable through the same fraudulent methods. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, claiming she had acted out of maternal love, and that she truly believed I was mentally ill. But the evidence against her was too overwhelming to be ignored. When Judge Andrade, an experienced 60-year-old magistrate with gray hair and piercing blue eyes, announced his decision to completely annul my interdiction and order the immediate arrest of the 3 conspirators for criminal association, fraud, and false imprisonment, I felt a deep satisfaction that mixed justice with sadness for the family betrayal. Ms. Beatrice is obviously in full possession of her mental faculties, declared the judge, looking directly at Margaret with clear disapproval. And the crimes committed against her represent a serious violation of the most basic human rights that our society must protect. Margaret was sentenced to 8 years in prison for leading the criminal scheme, while Dr. Santos received 6 years for document forgery and illegal practice of medicine, and Dr. Oliveira was sentenced to 5 years for producing false medical reports and participating in the conspiracy. The criminal network they had built was completely dismantled, with their victims being freed and having their assets restored through a collective judicial process that Julia coordinated with impressive mastery. My inheritance of 2 million reais was fully recovered, along with the interest and adjustments that had accumulated during the period it was under fraudulent control. But money, as important as it was, wasn't the most significant victory. The true achievement was having my freedom and dignity restored, as well as knowing that other people wouldn't be victimized by the same scheme in the future. During the trial, I discovered horrifying details about how Margaret had planned everything for months, studying similar cases of guardianship and hiring corrupt professionals through a network of contacts in the Brazilian legal underworld. She had gone to the point of researching drugs that could leave me confused during the forged psychiatric evaluation, demonstrating a level of premeditation that made her crimes even more shocking. How can a mother reach this point of coldness toward her own son? I asked Julia after the sentence, and she responded with wisdom that deeply marked me. Some people are capable of anything when money and power are involved. Unfortunately, family ties don't protect anyone from human greed. The months following the trial were of gradual reconstruction of my life and my confidence in human relationships, a slow but necessary process to overcome the trauma of having been betrayed in the cruelest way possible by the person who should protect me above all else. Julia accompanied me to therapy sessions with a genuine psychologist, who helped me process not only the trauma of illegal imprisonment, but also the emotional pain of discovering that my own mother was capable of destroying me for money. I moved to a new apartment in a part of the city where I could start over without constantly remembering the places associated with Margaret and our destroyed family. Using part of the recovered inheritance, I created a foundation dedicated to helping other victims of fraudulent guardianships, working in partnership with Julia to identify similar cases and offer free legal assistance to people who didn't have resources to defend themselves. The irony was that Margarete, trying to steal my money for herself, ended up inspiring me to use this wealth to make a difference in the lives of other people who went through similar situations. During this period of reconstruction, I also completely cut contact with all family members who had supported Margaret or who refused to believe my version of events, understanding that some bridges need to be burned so we can move forward with mental health. The initial loneliness was difficult, but gradually I built a new chosen family, composed of people who demonstrated genuine loyalty during my most difficult moment, especially Julia and Carla, who became a close friend after the trial. 1 year after my liberation, I received a letter from Margaret in prison, the first attempt at contact she had made since the conviction. The letter was full of requests for forgiveness and claims that she had acted out of misdirected love and fear that I would waste my inheritance. Reading those words caused me a complex mixture of emotions: anger at the attempt to minimize her crimes, sadness for the mother I thought I had, and even a bit of pity for the broken woman she had become. But I also felt something I didn't expect: indifference. During months of therapy, I had learned that forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, and that some betrayals are so deep that they permanently destroy the possibility of future relationship. I wrote a response letter, but not for reconciliation. It was to establish final boundaries and make it clear that she had forever lost the right to be part of my life. Margaret, I wrote, using her name instead of mother. You chose money over our family relationship. Now live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of your life. Do not respond to this letter, because there will be no further communication between us. Sending that letter was a final act of closure that allowed me to completely move forward, without looking back with regret or hope of reconciliation that would only keep me tied to the painful past. 2 years after everything began, I am in a position I never imagined possible during those terrible days at the clinic. I'm a stronger, wiser person, and ironically richer than before, not just financially, but also emotionally and spiritually. The foundation I created has already helped more than 50 families who were victims of similar fraudulent guardianship schemes, and our work has been nationally recognized as a model for combating this type of crime. Julia became not only my best friend, but also my partner in the foundation, and the person I trust most in the entire world. I met a wonderful man named Ricardo, a doctor who works with trauma victims, and our relationship is growing in a healthy way based on real mutual trust. More important than anything, I learned that family is not determined by blood, but by loyalty, genuine love, and willingness to sacrifice for the other's well-being. Margaret may have given me life, but the people I've chosen for my current family are those who truly care about my happiness and well-being. When I look back, I see that that terrible experience, as traumatic as it was, also freed me from a toxic relationship that was keeping me trapped in patterns of manipulation that had lasted since my childhood. Sometimes I reflect while working on another case of fraudulent interdiction. We need to go through the worst to discover what we're really capable of when we fight for our freedom and dignity. The decision to share my story publicly wasn't easy, but I felt it was important to warn others about how fraudulent interdiction schemes work and how to protect themselves from family members with criminal intentions. During an interview for a television program about human rights, the host asked me if I felt hatred toward Margaret, and my answer was completely honest. I no longer feel hatred, because hatred is a feeling that consumes the one who hates more than the one who is hated. I feel sadness that she chose to be a criminal instead of a true mother, but mostly I feel gratitude for having discovered her true nature before she caused even more damage to my life. The interview generated thousands of messages from people who had gone through similar situations or who suspected they were victims of similar schemes, proving that my story wasn't an isolated case, but part of a much larger social problem that needed to be exposed and fought. Many of these people became clients of our foundation, and some even became volunteers helping other victims recover psychologically from the traumas of family betrayal and legal abuse. Seeing how my terrible experience could be transformed into strength to help others gave me a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before in life. Today, 5 years after waking up in that psychiatric clinic without knowing how I got there, I can say with certainty that I am a completely different person, stronger, more independent, and more determined to use my freedom to make a difference in the world. Margaret remains in prison, and according to the latest information I received through legal channels, she still tries to claim innocence and blame the other members of the gang for deluding her about the nature of the crimes they were committing. This refusal to accept responsibility for her own actions confirms that I made the right decision in permanently cutting contact with her. People who cannot recognize their mistakes cannot be trusted for genuine change. Dr. Santos and Dr. Oliveira also remain imprisoned, and the criminal scheme they operated was completely dismantled, thanks to our joint work with public prosecutors and human rights organizations. Brazilian legislation on interdiction has also been modified to include additional safeguards that make it more difficult for criminals to abuse the legal system to steal assets from vulnerable victims. Knowing that my terrible experience resulted in systemic changes that will protect others in the future gives me a sense of closure and purpose that transformed my pain into something constructive and meaningful. Nobody should go through what I went through, I always tell the victims we serve at the foundation. But if you did, you can use that experience to become stronger and help others who are still suffering. This is my story of how I discovered that my own mother was capable of betraying me in the cruelest way possible, but also of how I transformed that betrayal into strength to rebuild my life in a more authentic and meaningful way. For anyone going through a similar situation of family abuse or fraudulent interdiction, I want you to know that it is possible to survive, recover, and even thrive after traumatic experiences like this. The most important thing is to never accept that you are crazy or incapable just because someone interested in your assets is trying to convince the world of that. Trust your own sanity, seek help from genuine and independent professionals, and remember that the truth always prevails when we have the courage to fight for it. My mother may have tried to steal my freedom and my money, but inadvertently gave me something much more valuable: the opportunity to discover my own strength and to create a life based on genuine values instead of toxic family obligations. Sometimes, I reflect while signing another foundation document, the worst betrayals free us from prisons we didn't even know existed. Did you like Beatrice's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.